Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Holy Comforter Episcopal Church's Fall 2020 Adult Christian Formation series called Liturgy, the Work of the People. I'm Jimmy Abbott, the priest here at Holy Comforter Episcopal Church in Spring, Texas. And it's really been a thrill getting to prepare these sessions and then gathering with you all via Zoom to reflect and to discuss and to think about all that this means for us, for our life together, and for our worship. Our final Zoom session will take place this Sunday, November 15th at 11:30 a.m. on Zoom. You can check the weekly blast email, or you can go to holycomforterspring.org/calendar to get the link to the event. It would be great to see you there and to have a final wrap-up conversation. We will have an Advent-specific series that will launch after Thanksgiving, but for this particular series, this is our final session, lucky session 13. I don't know how it happened that way, but it did. Again, this whole series has been framed from this question: why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God? So today, what I want us to do is to think about the future. We've talked a lot about the past, how liturgy has been shaped and changed. Last week, we talked about liturgies of the secular world. We've talked a lot about, the church calendar. We've talked about communion and baptism. We've talked about the clergy and laity. We've talked about all manner of things. So today I want us to consider what the future might look like, the future of liturgy. When I talk about the future of liturgy, I want to talk about two things: just where the Episcopal Church and our liturgy is going into the future, and then specifically how this particular pandemic, I think, will continue to shape our liturgy for years to come. So let's just first talk about the Book of Common Prayer. So here are some pictures of the old 1928 Book of Common Prayer. But I think the first question that comes up is just the technical one. Is there going to be a book? I think it's a really good question. I think most Episcopal parishes, especially before pandemic, were printing off some version of a paper worship bulletin. But at least now at Holy Comforter, most people are either bringing their own personal Book of Common Prayer, or they're downloading a pre-made worship bulletin and just using their phone or their tablet to follow along in the service. So the question is, are we actually going to have a paper book? I think this question has two roots. First of all, as you all know, it can be kind of difficult to navigate your way through the Book of Common Prayer for a worship service. Just take morning prayer. You are flipping back and forth constantly from the actual service of morning prayer to the psalm appointed for the day, to the lectionary, the daily office lectionary, and then back for the canticles, and then you got to find the collect for the day. That's always in a different place. So I think one of the questions, that question, is that there going to be a paper prayer book, is just rooted in the simple fact that it's very difficult to navigate the Book of Common Prayer. It is definitely not intuitive. Plus, there is stuff in our printed 1979 Book of Common Prayer that just doesn't seem to be all that helpful for our normal life in worship. Flip to page 880, and you see that there's the chart for finding the date of Easter. I mean, now we just Google it, right? So do we need to take up space, precious page space, with things like that anymore? I think that's part of what's going on. Second, we now have all these other supplemental liturgical resources. I've encouraged y'all to look at the Book of Occasional Services, the sort of appendix to the Book of Common Prayer. Beyond that, we also have Enriching Our Worship. Those are other supplemental liturgical materials. And there are 4 different books series there, Enriching Our Worship 1, 2, 3, and 4. And those are also just PDFs online. So the question is, rightly, I think, is there going to be an actual book? Here's what I see happening, and maybe it's just because this is what I would like to have happen. I think that there's going to be an official book called the Book of Common Prayer that will have all of these resources in it, but I think it will come in a multi-volume series, and so that you might have one book, one actual printed volume that is personal prayers and daily devotions. And it would have morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, compline, and the lectionary set aside for that. I could see that being in one book. Then I can see Sunday worship and baptisms being in one particular volume. And then all of our Episcopal services, ordinations, and confirmations being in a separate book or volume, so that you would buy one book, but it would be multiple volumes. And of course, I think there would be, along with that, electronic files that could be manipulated to make the worship bulletins that we've all become accustomed to, either on paper or digital. So I could see that just kind of how the Episcopal Church manages this going into the future. And I think a lot of it just comes back to that question of why. Why do we have this book? Well, we have a Book of Common Prayer because it is that. It's common. It is the thing that binds us together. But I think we also have to come to the place and realize that it can't just be the pages that bind us together. It has to be the sense of the Book of Common Prayer, the fact that we are praying these prayers together, not that it's just one bound volume that binds us together. I think into the future too, we're going to have questions about high church and low church. So here are two fairly famous, well-known parishes in the Episcopal Church. On the left, that is St. Mary the Virgin Episcopal Church in New York City, Smoky Mary's, as it's sometimes called. You see all the incense there, the proliferation of vestments. You can see the big organ, the stained glass windows. There's just a lot going on in there, right? An east-facing altar, lots of players and people there, lots of worship ministers, characters, if you will. Characters in a kind way, like it's like a play, right? When you have lots of people involved. And then on the other side, on the right, you see Christ Church, Alexandria, Virginia, a very low church. I mean, you can barely even see the altar, right? Do you see how it's tucked underneath the pulpit? The pulpit is this thing you climb stairs up into. You can tell that for Christ Church, Alexandria, the emphasis is on preaching and on the word. And then you even see there in the walls the creeds and the 10 commandments. And of course, all of the windows are clear glass. There's no stained glass. So high church and low church, emphasis on ritual and ceremony, emphasis on preaching and teaching. Now, my personal theory is that the low church party of the Episcopal Church is either dead or dying. The sort of old school evangelical Episcopal Church, evangelical not as its modern political connotation, but evangelical as an emphasis on preaching and the word, that has receded over time. And what is taking its place is a more broad church or high church idea of ritual and liturgy. I think that the only thing that the low church party got out of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer was a requirement that every service of the Holy Eucharist have a sermon. Other than that, I think it is very much a high church book, if you will. Even in our own diocese, the Diocese of Texas, a traditionally low church diocese, I think over time we've seen it creep up the candle, if you will. And so I think that into the future, we're going to see more and more emphasis on liturgy and on ceremony. I am going to reserve my judgment on that, and you can ask me about that offline. We'll talk about that in our Zoom discussion group, but that is my objective guess for the future, is that more and more churches will creep up the candle, if you will, and become more focused on ceremony and ritual and less focused on preaching and on the word. Now, why do I think that? I think because liturgy is super easy compared to preaching. Water will always find the path of least resistance. And I think there's a sense of that in church and in ceremony too. I mean, I know this as a priest and a pastor. It's a lot easier to just prepare for another worship service, to put on all the right vestments and just know where to stand and what to say, than it is to prepare a rigorous, robust sermon. It's a lot more difficult to do that, to put in the hard work beforehand to preach well, than it is just to be ready for another church service. So I think that's just part of reality, like I said, is that water will always find the path of least resistance. I'm not trying to knock the high church movement, but rather just to explain why I think the church is where it is and where it's going into the future. And I have many friends in the high church movement, and again, not a knock on their piety or faithfulness or their worship of the Lord Jesus. It's just different, and I think that we see these two parties within the Episcopal Church, and I think I see where we are going into the future, and I think it will be a higher church than it is now. I also want to talk about pandemic specific, where we see the church in the future. Hey, look, there's me. So on the left, you see an empty Holy Comforter nave. I think that as time goes on, we will see our naves begin to slowly fill back up, but it won't be quick. I just that's my sense of it. We have everybody in Holy Comforter, and I'm sure this is true in parishes across the Episcopal Church. Folks who are gung-ho to be back in church, they want to be there all the time. And regardless of whatever protocols or restrictions are or are not in place, they're going to be there. We have folks on the other hand, of course, who just will not be there. They are super cautious. Folks who want to see better treatments, more vaccines, decreasing case numbers of COVID-19 before they return. And so we're kind of stuck in this middle place right now when it comes to in-person on-campus worship. Now, at the same time, I do think that online church is here to stay. So here's me. You see, I got my microphone, I got my camcorder, getting ready for online morning prayer. One thing that I don't think is going to happen or has the legs or even should happen is just putting up a camera in the back of the nave, streaming an in-person service and calling that online church. I think what we've created during this time of pandemic are actual online communities, parishioners who see themselves as part of Holy Comforter, though they maybe don't live in the area, don't actually plan on stepping foot on the Holy Comforter campus anytime soon, but they are still members of our community. So I think that we have got to see online church and our liturgies for online church be crafted in such a way that they also feel as if they are still part of the community, not just watching another community worship. One of the best explanations I heard about this was when motion picture cameras were first invented, they would just put up the cameras in front of a vaudeville stage and just record the vaudeville acts and call that a movie. Think of how far we've moved from that to TV and movies today. And so, again, I don't think that we can just put up a camera and record what we usually do. I think that we actually need to be intentional about gathering people in the presence of God online in very special ways so that they are also worshiping in a way that fits where they are. I think hybrid services, we've done one hybrid service where there are people in the chapel and people online, and that the service is meant for both of them. I think that's a sort of bridge measure right now. Why do I think that won't last for long? As Jesus says in Revelation, I wish that you were either hot or cold, but I don't like lukewarm. I think that's true here, is that if you're going to do online church, do online church. If you're going to do in-person church, do in-person church. But trying to do both at the same time, I think actually weakens both of them. Now, that's going to make it a lot harder on churches, I think, to do liturgies and to gather people in the presence of God, in multiple ways, but I just think that that's the way of the future. So now we are coming to the end, and we're going to revisit this question. Why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God? Now, as I have shown and hope to have shown throughout this whole series, is that liturgy is always changing. Liturgy is always in flux, from the spaces in which Christians have gathered to the ways we've used art and music to worship. All of that has changed, but what hasn't changed is that we do gather on Sundays and other special days in the presence of God. Now, are we going to keep doing baptisms? Yes. Will we keep having Holy Communion? Yes. Ordinations, confirmations, all of those things will continue, though I would imagine that they will be different, as they are always different and have always been changing. The heart of it has not changed. The heart of worship will never change, but some of those outward appearances may change some. Think back to Richard Hooker, who was really truly the framer of Anglican thought. In his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, he lays out this framework of thinking about church and worship, of the immutable and the mutable things. And that's really what we've been trying to do during these 13 sessions. What are the things that absolutely cannot change? And what are the things that we can change if it's time for them to change? And that, I think, is a framework that we ought to go forward into the future with. What cannot change is that we are going to gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God. That will not change. How we do those things, how we worship, how we gather, be it in person or online, is always going to be changing. How we read words out of a book, how we pray our personal prayers, whether they're on a phone or from actual paper, will change. But again, what will not change is gathering on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God. So, as you can guess, that is your final journal question for this series. Why do you gather in the presence of God on Sundays and on other special days of the year? Why do you do that? Not how do you do it or when do you do it, but why? Again, it's been really wonderful going through all of this with you. I hope that some of you have read some of our supplemental materials, Praying Shapes Believing and Liturgy for Living. I know many of you have, and I've appreciated the conversation. Again, you can join us on Zoom on Sunday, November 15th at 11:30 a.m., and we'll reflect on all of this just as we continue to move into the future, but always as we continue to gather in the presence of God. Again, thank you all so much.